This is Lilia Pizzolanti interviewing Brent Cohen. And is it okay if I record this?
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you for asking.
Yep. So can you tell me a little bit more about your job?
Sure. I forget what I told you in the first place, but basically I work for a high net worth individual on real estate acquisitions and investing. Basically that means right now I'm running around trying to find apartment buildings and office buildings mostly that fit with our investment strategy, and then trying to acquire them on behalf of him.
Okay. So how has the pandemic affected your work?
It has a pretty big effect. I mean, we invest across the country, and so typically, when I see something that's interesting, I'll fly to wherever it is. I'll tour the property. I'll meet with the broker who's selling it, tour the market, do the whole song and dance to try to get up to speed on the investment and the local area. Obviously, with the pandemic, that is not possible. So I have not traveled since March, um, which is a pretty significant change in the way I do business. We've transitioned to, I've started doing virtual tours via FaceTime or Zoom, stuff like that, which isn't great, but it is filling the gap. And then I've started to use more third-party local contacts. So trying to find someone we trust that is close to the property in that city that can tour, and we use their feedback, and we basically just trust that they're looking for the same things we would be looking for. And we end up trusting their judgment, which again is very different from how the industry, myself, and the team have worked before, but it is an adjustment. It's the only way to do things at the moment because none of us are that comfortable flying.
So you already informed me that you have 2 kids. How has the pandemic affected their schooling?
They're both in daycare, all day daycare, and their daycare was closed for something like 2 months, and so that was quite challenging because we had to provide, we had to watch them, either myself or my wife, and we both have full-time jobs. What it ended up meaning was I've got the more flexible job, so I can really do my work whenever. So I would end up watching the kids for most of the day. And then after everyone went to bed, I would just take a few hours and try to get some work done. That is not the easiest thing to do. And obviously at that late at night, you can't call the people or talk to people you normally talk to. That was a big challenge. They've been back in for a couple months now. But the case rate is increasing locally. So it's kind of in the back of our minds. We're cognizant that daycare might close again, and we might have to go back to a scenario where one of us has to spend the day watching them. So we're lucky enough that I've got flexibility, but it's certainly a huge challenge. But we are muddling through okay at the moment.
So is the pandemic bad down there?
Hard to tell, because I'm in Montgomery County, which is a really large county population-wise. So you see the case counts locally, and it's always hard, to know if they're good or bad because there's just a lot of people that live here. What I can tell you is the direction is not good. They're very much going up just over the past week. And so locally, they'd actually done a really good job. It seemed like everybody was following the guidelines, doing what they could. And we got the caseload down really quickly. I don't know what the cause is. That's one of the frustrating parts. I'm sure for everybody is. It's very hard to tell why cases tick back up whenever they do. But just over the past week, it has become a bigger issue, and something we're thinking a little more about, especially, like Halloween tomorrow. We had made plans to do, outdoor scavenger hunts or something with my 3.5-year-old. Now we're rethinking that to decide if that is something we should skip or not.
Mm-hmm. So has the real estate market been more or less active from the pandemic?
less active, certainly when it first hit. There was a few months there where the market basically froze. Um, Too much uncertainty, and a lot is driven by whether you, when you buy a property, you almost always borrow a big chunk of the money to buy it. And so what you find is activity is often driven by whether the banks or lenders are still involved, and they are the most risk averse. So they want to take the least amount of risk of any counterparty or investor out there. And so when something like that hits, most of the time, all those groups just put their pencils down and decide we're not doing anything until we know what's going to happen, or at least can tell a little bit more seriously where we are. So that's where we were for a couple months. And then over the past month or two, it has started to break free where people kind of, cases have hit a plateau. People have kind of figured out what's what. The economic readings have gotten far enough that people, I guess, are putting a little more faith in them. It just feels like there's a little more certainty now than there was a few months ago. And so now we're starting to see deal volume tick up, activity tick up, but it's property dependent. So apartments are very active, but hotels, for instance, that is a absolute disaster. And we did own a large portfolio of hotels, but for most hotels, the vast majority of business is business travel. So it's not people. It is people like myself flying to I don't know, like Kansas City and staying over a night because I have to see a property. So that is the huge bulk of hotel business, and obviously in the pandemic that has evaporated. That's gone to almost zero. So hotels are struggling. Almost none of them are able to pay their bills anymore. And so for people like us, we had 28 hotels. We will probably exit the pandemic with maybe still owning one or two. Most of them will be given back to the bank because there's just no way to pay the debt service. We can't even pay the taxes because literally nobody is staying in the hotels.
Mhm. So I know you've had other jobs before the Schindler Group. What were some of these other jobs?
Most of them were in the same industry, as you might imagine. So I worked for a different fund locally in Philadelphia called Lubert Adler for a little bit. I worked for a company called Grosvenor in Center City, Philadelphia, that was actually owned by the Duke of Westminster, London royalty. But outside, that's all real estate and real estate advisory, so kind of doing the same stuff, just with different clients. But previous to that, and in other industries, I did worked for AT&T, kind of a corporate rotational program where you spend time in a couple different groups. I did that in college. And then long ago, my first job, I was actually a cashier at the BJ's Wholesale Club. So that's where I started working, kind of in a high school job type deal.
Mm-hmm. So did you have any valuable experiences to help you before getting into the Schindler Group from these other jobs?
Yeah, it tends to be how it works. It's kind of, everything is a stepping stone to something else. And once you get 5 to 10 years out, you realize that whatever background you have is now that's kind of your skill set and what you end up pitching to whatever employer you're trying to go work for. So it all, I started out of college as an analyst, which is basically doing what I'm told and trying to learn from older people on the team. And you kind of just progress up from there. To take on more and more responsibility until right now, I do almost everything myself. Most of my interaction with my bosses involves just sending an email saying, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, but it's your money, so just officially approve it before I send it out, something like that. And then before that, frankly, working at BJ's was valuable. You learn just to show up on time, and do that type of job, which I thought was very valuable, because it's something that, if you're responsible, you don't realize, but for many people, just showing up on time is a real struggle.
Yeah. So did you always want to be in the real estate field?
I wanted to be in investing. So there's different asset classes in investing. You can, public equities, which is, stocks that trade on the stock market. There's private investing, there's real estate, there's all sorts of places you can invest. So I just wanted to do that. It's all, at the end of the day, it's all fundamentally similar stuff in that you're paying a certain amount of cash and you're trying to figure out what the return on that will be, how much cash you're going to get back over what period of time. But I gradually, kind of fell into real estate and found that I really liked it because it's a little different than other sectors.
So both of investment and real estate are similar?
Well, as investing, you can do in a lot of different places. Real estate is one of the sectors you can invest in. So instead of buying stocks, I buy buildings. So it's a little bit different way of putting money out. Ultimately, your goal is the same. I mean, you're trying to earn a good investment return. So you're trying to earn more money than you put out, especially when adjusted for what risk you think you're taking. But I just chose to do it in real estate, and partially that's just because the only direct investment role I was offered out of undergrad happened to be at a real estate shop. If I had been offered one in a different sector, I might be doing that today.
Did you go to school for real estate, and was it hard? Like, was it hard going to school for real estate?
I went to school for finance. It was because real estate's a very small kind of niche sector. Very few schools have, quote unquote, real estate programs. So, for instance, I went to Penn State, which is a huge school, has almost every program you can imagine. But even there were maybe 2 classes on real estate. So I don't even think when I went there you could have a real estate major. I don't think that existed. So it was more finance, which as I said before, that's more just straight investing, and then you take those tools, those building blocks, and just apply them to real estate. So I went to school technically for finance.
What is your favorite part of your job?
Favorite part? It's relatively casual, as you can probably tell. I'm sitting in a sweatshirt. Part of that's because it's pandemic, but frankly, before that, I worked from home a great deal as well. That part of that's who I work for, the type of group I'm with. But real estate tends to be a little more casual. It has a very old school feel, so it's much more. You fly to a place, you spend time looking at the building with the broker. You go out to dinner with people. You have to tour the market because you really have to learn how each city works and why one block is better than the other. So it's a little more soft skill driven. It's not just sitting behind your desk looking at a bunch of numbers and trying to figure out what they're telling you. So it's a little bit. I think it's a little more colorful than that, and it can be done pretty efficiently on your own, and it scales well. So we do a lot of investing, but our team is only 10 people. So I never liked. I worked at AT&T in that internship, which was kind of this huge office complex, thousands of employees, and found I really didn't like that atmosphere. I didn't like feeling like I was just one out of 2,000 faceless people. So that bothered me. That's just my personality type. So this is much more independently driven, self-motivated. I don't really report to people that often. There's no FaceTime. My boss doesn't care, what time I sign on or off during the day. It's very much as long as you can be trusted to do your work and you do good work, then people will leave you alone, which appeals to me.
Yeah, that sounds nice. So you have to travel a lot for your job?
Yeah, at least until until the pandemic,
Yeah.
a fair amount of travel. Tried to keep it short because of the small children to help my wife out. Sometimes that means long trips. I mean, I would fly to LA or Seattle for literally a half-hour meeting and turn right around and get back on a plane. So that leads to some very long days. But it's, I personally don't mind it that much. You get on an airplane, and if it's 5 hours, it just means I have 5 hours to sit without being bothered. No phone calls, no people distracting me. I can either do work or, watch a movie or something. I don't actually mind that much. But certain people, really hate, the hassle of going to the airport, going to security, sitting, that sounds awful for some people. So it is very much driven by whatever your personality type is, and mine just happens to be okay with that type of thing.
So what's your favorite city to travel to then?
Hmm. That that is a hard question. I don't know that I really have one, because they're all different. I like going to a lot of different cities, and frankly, if you're only there for a night, it doesn't matter how big or small the city is. You can occupy yourselves for one night. Um, but I will, I like going. I bought a property. I mentioned Kansas City earlier because I just happened to buy an apartment building a little while ago there. But places like that, which you generally would not go to for like tourist reasons, like New York, I've been to New York, countless times. So that's less fun than me having a reason to go somewhere like Kansas City or some city, I would never go otherwise. It gives me a reason to be there and see something that I haven't seen before.
Yeah. So what advice do you have for anyone trying to get into the real estate field?
Get into real estate. Well, talk to people in real estate. Um, that it is still very, it's not as institutional as other areas. And what I mean by that is it's not, the pathway hasn't been as strictly defined. So certain industries and places to work, it's very set. There's big companies and they post jobs. You submit a resume and you go through an official process that's very organized and well planned out. Real estate is not like that. It's very much talking to people. A lot of the teams, like my own, are small. We don't hire a ton of people. We generally don't know when we need people. And often, I myself got hired not because they really needed somebody, just because I spoke to them, got to know them over a little while, and then we decided, hey, this might be extra value for you to come work full time for us. It wasn't it wasn't them sitting there saying we need somebody. So that makes it difficult for some people because there's no step by step directions to say this is you got to do this first, then this second, and this third. But if you are willing to kind of do the soft skill stuff and just talk to people and take the time to find out how to reach out to people, then it can actually be easier to get in. But it's, for me, studying finance, because those are the building blocks if you want to be on the investment side. But there's a lot of other side. There's management, where you're just managing the day-to-day operations of the property, property managers, marketing. I mean, there's really every type of role in it. So it really depends on which side of things you want to be on.
So it's kind of a hard field to get into, sort of.
I don't want to say hard. It's a field most people don't even know that exists. I'll put it that way. It's if you know it exists and you know what it is, then it becomes much easier. But like I bet you, I mean, I guess you're a little young, but when you go to college and ask 100 people what they want to do, I bet you almost none of them will say real estate acquisitions, because it's just not something people have a connection to. They don't see it every day. So they don't think about it. And when something is not in front of you, it's you'd be surprised how much you don't realize is out there. So that's part of the challenge. Is there's not many people that do it professionally, so you're not likely to run into them that often. Um, but like I said, now since you've spoken to me, you know it exists. So if you're interested, you already have a huge advantage on everybody else out there.
Yeah. So you told me that you used to play soccer. What are some of your other interests outside of your job?
Interests outside of my job. Well, my kids, they take up a lot of time, as you can probably imagine. But it's still sports. I just watch them rather than play them at this point. Um, and then, I mean, nothing too strange or exciting. Sports, movies, television. But yeah, most of it is just sitting there watching my kids play at the moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how do you make the evaluations to decide if you should buy the buildings, and how much do you sell them for?
That is an excellent question. I mean, that is something that there's no real answer to. Generally, so we have a strategy. So we kind of know the types of stuff we want to buy. So for instance, right now in apartments, we want to buy uh, larger buildings. So something with 200 apartment units or more, because when they're that big, they're more efficient to manage. You can afford to have full-time staff on site. So that's kind of one set criteria. We have minimum size in terms of how much we want to spend to make sure it's worth our time. And we want stuff that was built, in the last 10 to 15 years, because we don't want older properties that require more maintenance. So there's a whole bunch of rules like that that kind of sets the box. So you know what kind of stuff you're looking for, and then when you find it, it's more. We have return thresholds, so it's we want to earn a minimum profit. So it's kind of looking at the numbers and trying to figure out if a particular deal will deliver that for us. Most of the deals are represented by a broker, so it's a sales broker. He or she will tentatively, they'll give you guidance as to what they think it will cost, because there's a lot of people competing for it, a lot of other groups. So you kind of take their guidance, but it involves a lot of talking to people. So talking to the broker, talking to people on the ground, managers who are familiar with the market, looking at what other similar buildings sold for. That's pretty standard. So if I want to know if this is worth X, and I find a building down the street that is very similar and it sold last year for roughly the same price, then that gives me added confidence that the value is where it should be. But a lot of it is just judgment. It's looking high level and saying, hey, is this a good location? Is it, what's access? Where do the people who live here work? How long does it take them to get to work? If I was living in this city, is this a submarket that I'd want to be in? Where are the amenities? Where's the grocery store? Where are the schools? How good are the schools? All the questions that you'd probably ask if you were moving somewhere, are questions that we ask when we're deciding whether to buy an apartment building, because people are going to live there, and that's ultimately who our customers are going to be.
So what are the different types of buildings that you buy?
So we've bought a lot of different things. Right now, it is garden style apartment communities mostly, which is kind of they're suburban. It's kind of, you go to an apartment complex and there might be five different buildings. They're 2 to 3 stories tall. That type of community. Or we're also looking at very large single tenant office buildings. So for instance, right now I'm looking at one in Minneapolis, which is an insurance company just built a headquarters for themselves. And now they want to sell it, and lease it back from the person they sell it to for a long period of time. So this is, a bright, really shiny, brand new office building, with one tenant that has a very good credit rating, which means, the market thinks that they will pay their rent for a long period of time. That means it's a very safe investment, which also means it's a very expensive investment. But that's kind of the two ends of the barbell we're looking at right now. But it changes day to day. We go where we see interesting opportunities. That just happens to be where we're focused right now.
About how many apartment or buildings do you buy and sell per year?
So we have a target dollar figure. So we want to buy $400 to $500 million of gross real estate each year, and that can be any combination of number of deals. So it depends if the deals are big or small. If we do a deal that's $300 million, then that obviously means that what we're only going to do 2 to 3 deals that year. Or we could go to the opposite end of the spectrum, and we got to do 7 or 8 smaller deals. So it really depends. But our founder, whose money we're investing, basically just wants to buy a lot of real estate. He doesn't particularly care what size the individual building is, as long as we get to those aggregate numbers each year.
What makes a building more expensive and less expensive than others?
Mm-hmm. That is, that is the fundamental question that comes with all investing. Basically, it's just tends to be, how safe is the cash flow? So, for instance, you buy an apartment building, and as I said, if it's brand new, it's probably, there's lower risk that you're going to have to spend money to replace the roof next year, or replace the air conditioning or plumbing systems, that type of thing. So newer tends to be less risk than older. Um, so that's a big driver, is just how much, how volatile you think the cash will be, how much risk there is to it. And then it depends on your strategy. Some people like to, buy apartments, fix them up, rent them out at higher rents after they fixed them up and made them nicer, and then sell it because the value of the property is increased, because the rents have increased. That's not our strategy. We tend to buy cash flows that are safe and already in place, and just want to hold them for a very long time. But it's, how much do we like the location? How much risk is in the cash flow? Is it somewhere where we look out, 30, 35 years really. So we look at it, and sometimes it's just looking at the land itself and saying, hey, in 30 years, this might not be an apartment building anymore. But do we like the piece of ground, and do we think the ground is going to be worth a lot because it is, located in a very dense, wealthy area of a good city or something like that, where we can say, you know what, we're really happy to be here for a long time.
Is there a lot of paperwork involved with your job?
Everything we do, when you buy a property, you have to negotiate a contract, which ends up being a pretty long legal document, which sets it out. And then there's all sorts of other stuff, because then you get a mortgage, and that's documented. You have people go and inspect the property, to make sure it's not going to fall over, and that's documented. So all these things tend to create these pretty big reports. But at the end of the day, the investment side folks focus on the bullet points that are going to drive value, and then we kind of hand it off to our attorneys and say, okay, make sure the language in the contract says what we agreed to. So they'll get a list of bullets and say, this is what we agreed to with the other side. Now you work with their lawyers to make sure that the contract says what we think it says. So that way, if something goes wrong and we fight about it, you look at the document, and it's all there in the language.
Well, that's good. What other professional fields are similar to the real estate field?
It depends where you are in real estate. So in my case, it is not too dissimilar from investing in the stock market, investing in commodities, any other sector. Again, investing at the end of the day is investing, but there are other areas. We hire property managers to manage our apartment buildings, and so that's probably more unique, because you're dealing with the day-to-day business of running an asset, which means you've got a couple hundred tenants. Some of them have complaints, and the types of stuff we buy tend to do things like community activities. There's a lot of programming. There's a lot of amenity space, pools, gyms, all this stuff. So it's really a small community you're running. So that we kind of oversee, but we hire someone else. That's kind of the more unique side of the real estate, but I don't actually touch that much of it. We just hire people that we trust to run that part, because I'm not an expert at doing that stuff.
So is the real estate industry competitive?
Yes. Anytime people are investing, putting lots of money to work, it will be very competitive, because if you're putting a lot of money out, if things cost a lot of money, that means there's a lot of money to lose, which means people tend to spend a lot of time and effort making sure they won't lose money. So as I said before, if we're doing $400 million of investing each year. Now, a lot of that, as I said, is borrowed money, but it's still a lot of money that our founders putting out. You can imagine if you have that much money at risk, you are going to be very concerned that you are doing everything you possibly can to make sure your decisions are correct. And it is competitive. So when we're buying something, we're bidding against other people. Most of them are auctioned properties. So we've got, we're competing against a dozen other teams, that are also very smart people and industry experts, and everybody is trying to not to overpay, but at the end of the day, you only get the deal if you pay more than everybody else. So it can be quite challenging, but that's where the fun is.
Like the out of the different types of buildings, like what's
Yeah.
one that you usually don't sell or buy?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of different types of real estate. So there's office buildings, there's hotels, there's apartment buildings, there's retail centers. So your shopping centers where you go to the grocery store. Those are kind of your main. Those are the main sectors where most people focus. But there's a bunch of niche sectors too. So you can buy like self-storage facilities, where you rent like a storage locker somewhere and there's just 1,000 storage lockers. That's its own type of real estate, and that is that's a sector certain people specialize in. There are people who go around and you could specialize, well, not specialize, not you can focus on things like private campsites where you rent out spaces to RVs for a night or two. So there's a lot of different weird, I can they're smaller and not as large, but there's tons of stuff like that that we don't look at for a bunch of different reasons. But it's just basically if you drive down the street or down the highway, I mean everything you see is some type of investable real estate or another. It's just a matter of where it falls into.
So what's some of the different spaces where you see it and you just say no, like I don't want this?
Hmm. So right now, if it's not because of our strategy, if it's not apartments or office buildings, we're probably not looking at it at all. And then within that, if I get an apartment building that was built in 1960, in in a very small market, in the middle of nowhere, I don't know what a good example is going to be, but that's something that we're not going to look at. So that criteria I mentioned earlier. If things fall short of that criteria, and there's tons of that stuff. I see probably dozens every day that just they don't fit our needs, so we won't pay attention to them.
Um, does your company only buy and resell buildings, or do you buy buildings and rent spaces out?
We we very rarely sell anything. So we tend to buy it and want to hold it long term. So I guess that's buying it and renting out. We'll buy an office building if it's a multi-tenant building, and we'll be the landlord. And over time, we'll just rent it out as space to different people and try and earn our money that way. And then every once in a while, if somebody comes and offers us what we think is a good price, then we'll sell it. But we don't buy things planning to sell them, which is much different than other groups that we compete with, which are structured differently. They might have to buy it and say, all right, we're buying it now and we have to sell it in 5 years. And our goal is to increase the value between now and then. That's the more typical way to do things, actually.
So what part of the buying buildings are you mainly in charge of?
The whole thing. Well, in charge of is I'm not in charge of anything. We'll put it because it's not ultimately everything has to be approved by my boss, but I am in charge of the process. So we're kind of on our own, and I have a couple counterparties that we go around and we find things that we think are good fits that we're interested in, that we think are good investments. Then we will bring it back before our bosses, which is there's a couple partners, and then there's the big guy at the top, the high net worth guy. I mean, it's his money, so he ends up having the final say on everything. So he is technically in charge, but generally, it don't get told no that often because we know what we're looking for and we kind of know ahead of time what they're going to say yes or no to. But in terms of the process, that is mostly on my plate. So that's everything from finding the deal, underwriting it, which means putting all the assumptions together for how it's going to perform, what it's going to be worth, how we're going to close the transaction, and then managing the process. Getting the people to inspect it, finding someone to borrow money from to help buy it, all that stuff tends to be mostly on my plate for the deals I bring in. And then there's other guys who bring in their own deals, and there's a few of us operating somewhat independently.
So do you ever buy not well kept buildings and then fix it up, or no?
No, that is something that is very popular and a lot of groups do. And I have previously worked for firms that do that, but not currently. Our strategy now is just buy things that are already nice, that we don't have to do a lot of work on, and hold them for a long time.
So I know that you often sell apartment and off or just buildings. What is the difference between selling those types of buildings and selling houses?
Nothing.
Oh,
And that's the key. I mean, it's different because it's a different building and it's bigger, but the basics are the exact same. Instead of a realtor, you'll have a broker. It's the same thing. They will be the ones that are working for the seller, and they'll be in charge of kind of wrangling the buyer, answering their questions, collecting the offers, and then talking with the seller about which offer they should take, and then working to actually sell the building. Um, but frankly, it really is similar. It's all real estate. It's just a different size, a different scale. But process-wise, I mean, the contract looks similar, the inspections look similar. We do a few more of them than you would do per house, but it's really it looks a lot of it is the exact same.
thank you for agreeing to do this with me, and all of the information that you gave me is really interesting.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.